the idea of the tradition, I think, is something which all iconographers hear a lot about. And some people get really animated about the idea of the tradition, to the point that it can be anything or everything, from whether you use egg emulsion with wine, or whether you use it with vodka, or whatever it might be, right through to the sort of dogmas of the church. It's a very wide-ranging sense of some overwhelming authority, which somehow makes iconography very different to your other sort of religious painting, which is much more sort of seen as a sort of expression of your inner faith and your own feelings and reflections. Whereas when you're painting icons, there seems this sort of looming figure of the tradition, which is somehow demanding something of us, and which can actually create a great deal of tension within the iconographic community. And not least between Orthodox and non-Orthodox, between Catholics and Orthodox and non-mainstream sort of Catholic churches. And because it gets very polemical, I think one of the things that we lose is the ability really to hear what the tradition means as people try to live with it. As something which is dynamic and a living force, which really roots us in the life of Jesus as it continues to animate us, to meet us, to inspire us, and to redeem us and open heaven for us. So, Rachel, I know Rachel because you are one of my students, which is a great privilege for me, and I'm sure a great trial for you, but nevertheless you have very kindly agreed to come on this programme and join in this conversation. And Catherine, we've not really met before. We've corresponded a little bit via Facebook, and I know that you're one of Aidan's students on the Prince's School's iconography course. So I know that little bit about you. But you both seem, this maybe I'm wrong here, but you both seem to have a pretty good theological grasp. And you're not just sort of painting by numbers. Iconography is really something that's important to you and your vocation. Actually, do you two know each other?
I think we know each other by name more than having met in person. We were both based in the Diocese of Peterborough for a time, so I've certainly known Sister Rachel, but I think we've probably only done a little more than pass in the corridor or been at similar events, but I don't think we've ever had a long conversation anyway.
Right.
That's some conference or something like that.
Yeah.
But you're both iconographers.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I've been learning to paint icons sort of more formally for 6 years. So I started in 2016, training with Aidan, and for the last 3 years that's been more intense by doing the course that you mentioned. But actually I started thinking about iconography and looking into it before I was ordained, so that's about 16 years ago.
Okay, and Rachel, what about your connection with iconography?
Well, icons have always been around for me in a sense. They've always been part of my prayer life and so on. And I think it's I got to a point where there was something I needed to try and express about the relationship, my relationship, our relationship with God, and couldn't work out quite how to do it. And there's one particular icon that caught my attention and stayed with me. And I realised that to learn any more about how this was helping me or speaking into that place. I needed to learn something about how it was created, why it was created like that. And that's where my interest started, and that's a long time ago. I'm thinking maybe 12 years, something like that. And then you know, put these things down sort of, and they bubble along under the surface, and then I really thought, I really want to attend to this. And then various things happened. My father was ill, and so on, and he then died. And on the back of that, it's like, okay, so I'm really now going to do something for myself here, in inverted commas, myself. And so I began to explore it more seriously. So I had a couple of years with Hannah, and then 2 years ago started with you, Ian. So it's been bubbling along for a long time, I think.
And I mean, both of you are people with a pretty serious sense of vocation. Can't get more serious than a hermit. And somebody who's ordained. So you're both people who obviously take your faith very seriously. It's shaping your life. And yet here you are fiddling around with icons. Now, how on earth did that come together? What's going on here?
And it's an interesting thing, because when I talk to people about iconography, and apart from the fact that they wonder how on earth I find time alongside being a parish priest as well, but there's that sense of, am I doing icons in my spare time as a hobby, if you like? Rather than how I see it, which is very much as an extension of my priesthood. And I've done a lot of thinking around sort of the role of iconographer and the role of priest, and what they have in common in terms of interpreting the faith for those who are engaging with either the image or the spoken word. And it was very much as part of my formation as a priest when I was at theological college before being ordained in my training, that I started thinking about this question of how can we communicate the theology of the church in a different way.
When you say different way, you mean different to preaching?
Well,
or...
I mean, yeah, in some ways, because, I mean, when you're at theological college, obviously there are piles of books that you're required to read, books and articles, and it's very much an academic course. So we study the different principles of theology and of the church and the history of the church and all those modules. And I found myself increasingly frustrated with the wordiness of it. And actually, I think probably hankering after something similar to what Sister Rachel was saying about actually the spiritual dimension. And we were analysing everything, we were learning it and dissecting the theology. And I had somewhere in my sort of development and my thinking was this idea that when we're ordained in the Church of England, there's this wonderful phrase that we are called to preach the gospel afresh in every generation. And I became acutely aware that actually as a generation now, we are really visual. Everything is logos and colour, and symbol and emojis, and all of that is a visual language.
And in fact, you could
I was
actually say that never has our culture been more visual, because we've had, first of all, photography, printing, colour printing, moving film, and now of course the internet, computers, what we're using now. So I mean, I really get what you're saying there. That's a very powerful observation about contemporary society. So you're saying, right, you want to proclaim the gospel to contemporary society. Our society is very visual. How does iconography, I mean, this ancient, old-fashioned way of painting, which you find in a museum or, you know, in nice arty books, how does this connect with, I don't know, the great swathe of unbelievers in Northampton? Where do you see this connection? How does that work?
Gosh, I agree that we are in a visual society now, and perhaps certainly in its extent, it's unprecedented. But actually, if we do go back in the history of the church, belief and faith was really visual because the levels of literacy were far lower than they are today. So actually, if we think about the beauty of the buildings of our medieval, I have a Grade 1 listed church that I'm responsible for, dating from the 12th century. We have beautiful buildings, we have stained glass. So imagery has always been within the church. And I think, for me, one of the key elements that connects with people is actually beauty. The idea that the divine can stop people in their tracks and actually speak and say something different from what is all around us in the world today. And I think that word that is spoken is one of beauty.
Now that is absolutely fascinating. I want to just come back and share something just to sort of push the conversation into a deeper sort of level. And I was listening to a talk about Hans Urs von Balthasar, great Catholic theologian, who wrote tons and tons and tons about the glory of God and this sort of stuff. But he says the summary of the church's tradition is the sign of beauty. And this is something that Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, picked up. The pressing need of our time is to rediscover the response of the heart to beauty, and that this is a more real knowledge than rational deduction. So he's saying the tradition of the Christian church, which is really what this conversation, I hope we will dig into, is about beauty as the sign that the beauty of Christ is the sign of the whole faith, of the tradition. So when we encounter the beauty of Christ, it's somehow more than just simply reading a theological definition or a theological exposition or a theological reflection in words, but it's when you touch maybe the sweetness of beauty that we're really getting to the core of the church's tradition. How do you both react to that observation of Ratzinger and von Balthasar?
I've got lots of things going through my head actually listening to that. I think one of the things that I have found, shall we say, tedious about being within the institution of the church is that it has seemed to me that the church tries to teach everything to death. From alpha courses and upwards, it feels like everything is taught, and there's very little space left. And there's very little space left for mystery, and there's very little space left for personal reflection, and reflection, I suppose, reflection on personal experience too. And I think all of that plays into that, because I think if the idea of beauty, well, I think we all carry that within us. And so there's something actually we know about that within us that we actually don't have to be told. We have to have the space to remember it in some way.
Would you say remember or activate?
So I'm sitting here thinking, is that another of the ways in which icons potentially resonate with people in different ways? And if I think about what else I do in terms of what we might call ministry, I spend quite a lot of my other time doing spiritual direction, or offering spiritual direction, I should say. And at heart, that is about holding a space for somebody, and holding a space in which they may encounter God. And I think I spend a lot of my time in that side of ministry, in one way or another, saying to people, sort of, look here, notice this. You know, in the Gospels, the angel would arrive and say, behold. Well, hang on, we're not angels, but there's something about notice this. And that again seems to be a huge parallel, I think, with standing in front of an icon. There is that space to experience ourselves and experience ourselves in relation to God. So yes, I've got lots of things sparking off in my brain, having heard what Catherine said.
Yeah, because I mean, listening to that idea of space kind of draws me back to those initial explorations that I was having at theological college, because obviously learning a lot of the bookwork, everything being taught, I was yearning to try and represent that theology in a different way through visual means, and to reinterpret the theology by creating pictures and images. And I started out with acrylics, a very contemporary sort of geometric style. But what I found through creating those images prayerfully and reflectively was that though every decision I made was deliberate, the end result produced something more than what I had planned. And that it was that journey of representing theology visually that led me into looking into icons. And yes, that their ability to create space and to be slightly odd looking. They're not typical images, they're not easy to look at, but they do make you stop and take the time and think, well, why is it like that? What is it saying? And so that sort of yearning to explore for ourselves rather than being told what the answers of faith should be.
So this is within a theological college, your own journey into something more than words. But I could say, well, all those words that you've used to describe how icons can work could be true of any religious art. So why icons? What makes them different? And this, I think, is, I'm going to push you to come back to the idea of tradition. And, you know, there's, you know, if I put it this way, if you've got, you can have a very entertaining speaker who could stand up on a Sunday morning and preach, but not mention God or religion, but do a very interesting life story, and everybody, oh, that was just wonderful, but it wouldn't be the gospel. There's, from my perspective, something here about saying, well, you're talking about proclaiming Christ, about this real encounter with him, And there's something about iconography which is a given. There's a sort of givenness about it. It's, you know when it's an icon and when it isn't, even if it's not easy to quite pin down to say, well, what makes it an icon, what doesn't. But there is a sort of receiving of something like, you can say it from the East or from the Eastern Church and this sort of stuff. There's different ways we say it, but there is a sort of sense of, I can't just do what I like with this. I mean, I think, would you both agree with that?
Yes, I would. I'm not quite sure if this is what you're meaning, Ian, but no, I can't do just what I want to do, because this isn't about me painting what I want to paint. It's somehow different to that. It's it remains really important for me to keep trying to, and I think this sounds paradoxical, but keep myself out of the picture. And I say it's paradoxical because, yes, I then have to concentrate and be really intentional on all those things. But I'm not making much sense, I don't think, here. But it is about, it's not simply me deciding to paint whatever and to paint it in this way or that way. There is something really important about the how of it, what it's actually saying. But what it's saying is not, again, not about what I want to say, but what emerges out of my relationship with God, my relationship with Christ, as I am contemplating producing whatever. Does that make any sense, Ian?
Okay.
Does that make any sense, Ian?
Yeah. No, that makes sense, Rachel. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Catherine, because we picked up the ball from you, so where do you see this morally?
I would agree up to a point, and I think, I mean, yes, the Eastern tradition is very well established, and there are principles of how one approaches an icon. And as you say, those of us who've sort of worked with icons long enough, we know when it's an icon and when it isn't, when it's just a piece of religious art. And there is a very clear distinction. But I mean, I've been thinking about this, and for me, I think what the Orthodox iconographic tradition holds is, it's like a language. You learn a language and it has grammatical principles and structures that define what that language is and how an icon would look. But at the same time, I agree with Rachel that we need to keep ourselves out of the picture, but we cannot help but sort of infuse what we produce with our own journey and our own faith. And therefore, I mean, I am an Anglican priest. I am a female iconographer, and all those lenses, if you like, will tune what I produce and affect the way an icon emerges from me. And what I'm really interested in, therefore, is there a distinctively Anglican lens for iconography that we can perhaps rediscover? Icons were part of the church, generally speaking, before the divisions, before the Reformation. What would it look like to find an Anglican voice, but within that wider tradition.
So, Catherine, as you've just, I think, just put the pin right between the joint, in that you're talking about a distinctive Anglican voice which articulates the tradition. What's the tradition here? Where's, okay, the struggle to find a distinctive Anglican voice, I can understand that. But you're talking about also some other sense which is somehow bigger than Anglicanism, somehow bigger than what? What do you see here? What are you wanting something distinctive within what? What's that tradition that you mentioned?
I mean, its biggest sense, it's actually trusting the ability of the divine to reach through an image, to speak to the heart of those that perceive it.
Okay.
And that's a lot of kind of highfalutin words, but that's what it's about. It's opening a communication between the divine and the person who looks upon the icon. And it's about what the iconographer chooses to include or exclude that somehow, we hope, helps to mediate that communication.
And how, I could take that and apply that to anybody doing any art, any religious art, anything from the messy church banner through to, a Leonardo da Vinci, or a Michelangelo, or iconography. As you could just sort of have a very broad sense that iconography is just another sort of style of religious art. I'm sure you don't mean that. So because I know from your training and with Aidan and so on, and looking at work behind you, you're articulating something which isn't just any piece of religious art. It is something which we'd all say, that's an icon behind you. That's beautiful. Like, it speaks, it resonates. It will work as an icon in a whole range of contexts. And if we didn't know that you'd painted it, it would still work. So what's this other, this whatever's going on there? How do you experience that or articulate it or understand what you're doing when you're groping, when you're painting and being creative and you're trying to paint that icon, like the one of St. Michael behind you? What is it? Where's this tradition that you then try to find the Anglican voice of? What's that tradition? Where is it? Where do you go when you're painting, when you're experiencing this?
And I think, what's rising up within me is actually the recollection of the Eucharistic prayer, and that we are part of the communion of saints through every generation, that in our worship we are joining with the saints and angels and archangels through all that we offer. And so if you're looking for that sort of that bigger quality, it's probably time, or perhaps more correctly, timelessness. That by using the principles of iconography, we are actually joining in with a visual song that has been sung throughout the generations of all the saints.
Okay, so it's something heavenly and liturgical.
Yes.
For you, that's part of that defining meaning behind when you use the word tradition.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Rachel, how do you respond to that? As a non-ordained person, I think it's fascinating having somebody who's ordained, who stands at the altar, who celebrates the Eucharist, and then a layperson who's participating in the same service, but obviously from a slightly different point.
I suppose what I'm thinking as I'm hearing that is that I think it's about truth somewhere with a capital T, and that we're trying to articulate something of truth, and that is, and I suppose we are fallible human beings trying to portray in some way some truth that is infallible, and therefore we need to have tools to enable us to make good decisions, I think. So I think that's where I would stop at that point, actually.
Okay. I mean, in terms of teaching iconography, that put it on the other thing, back to front. As a teacher, it's very easy to talk about techniques and say, oh, you do it like this. And actually, one of the things that drives me bonkers is some of my students just want the technique. Oh, well, I was taught that this was the technique and that this is the tradition. So it's all about technique. It's all about being able to copy as closely as possible examples that have gone before. But I find that, to be honest, a really dead thing. You know, simply being able to copy well, is that really being articulating the tradition? And I must admit, I find that really quite dry to the point of being deathly. It's almost a parody of what I find in an icon, and what I try to do as an iconographer. I want an image which is resonating with the divine person being represented, who is a living being in the presence of God, in the eternal worship of the Holy Trinity, and it's a truly transfiguring image that captures something of the divine light. Now, when I talk about that, for example, capturing, articulating, reflecting, resonating with the divine light, then you have to be able to talk about the divine light. That has to mean something. And outside of the mainstream Christian tradition, then it gets that's very nebulous. But certainly within the mainstream of orthodoxy, for example, their understanding of what the divine light is and how that works in creation, and they have a whole cosmology, which means as an iconographer you have an understanding of the material world and how you're interacting with that. And I think Aidan Hart is really brilliant at articulating that really profound, quite deep theology and philosophy in something that's very tangible and immediate. And I think it's one of the reasons why Aidan's so popular, is because he really able to open up this wonderful treasure trove for people who maybe don't belong to that Eastern mind and find that a bit off-putting. So he sort of opens that up. And that as an iconographer, trying to wrestle with articulating this other world that's sort of lost to our sight is a real tall order. And it's a very different thing, I think, to what you do as a natural artist who's painting nature, or as an interpreter of realities that you might do as a modern artist. You're actually trying to sort of somehow embody this unseen world and make it visible, which is what happens in the liturgy, certainly in terms of the Orthodox understanding of the liturgy. So icons work naturally, I think, within that liturgical context of the Eastern Church. As an ordained priest celebrating the Anglican liturgy, does any of this really grab you as what you're doing in your iconography, or is this somehow a bit outside? I don't know. How do you feel about that? How do you respond to that? Because I know you understand the concept of what I'm talking about from your own formation. So
yeah, no, I mean, one of my understandings of the role of the priesthood, if you like, is to be as a bridge, a go-between, to stand in that liminal place between earthly and heavenly. As priest, I represent the people to Christ, and I represent Christ to the people.
Right. And
that comes through in all sorts of different contexts in parish life, certainly at the altar and in celebrating the Holy Mysteries. Also in a funeral service, standing at that place of commendation and commending somebody to God's eternal protection. As priests, we stand, if you like, on the threshold. And for me, that resonates really powerfully with the role of iconographer. That the iconographer needs to understand or have some experience of those spiritual depths of the heavenly, the realms, and in order to somehow translate them into the earthly matter that we then use the techniques for. And at a very practical level, I know that if spiritually I'm not in the right place, or I've had a really rubbish week or whatever it is, if I try and pick up a paintbrush, it's just not going to work, however hard I might try. All the technique won't get me to work that I'm happy with. Actually, if I know I'm in that place, it's when I retreat to prayer and to stillness, because technique on its own won't allow me to depict anything heavenly.
One thing just went through my mind, maybe this is a bit unfair of me, but would you say the same thing about when you celebrate the Eucharist? Say on a Sunday morning, you've had a really rough week, a really bad week, and yet you've got to be in that liminal place. I love that word, that liminal place, and you're going to be that mediator, even though you've maybe crushed, fed up, in a really bad mood, I don't know, kicked the dog 5 times and feeling really, really, really bad about that. Whatever's been going on, what would be the difference when you, as an iconographer, pick up that brush or that pencil, or when you stand at the altar? Am I overplaying the connection, or is it just two very different things? Or what makes that iconography so sensitive to what's going on?
If I talk about being at the altar first, because I'm certainly a more experienced priest than I am iconographer.
Right.
At the altar, the liturgy operates and holds a lot of what happens behind the altar. So actually, if I'm not in the best place, actually it's about handing over that Eucharist to God, to trusting in the liturgy, to trusting in God's Spirit.
Right.
Because actually the ultimate purpose in the end is the action of the Spirit on the elements. And so it is an act of trust, and perhaps sometimes when I'm least feeling it, my trust in God has to be the greatest.
And would it be fair to say that when you have that experience, what is being provided is the tradition of the Anglican Church, which is the liturgy, its words, its form, its how it happens, and that somehow you can trust in that. Would that be fair to say that is the tradition?
Yeah, I think so. And I was about to say that actually that's how it links in with iconography. That, in going back to what Rachel was saying earlier, you were talking about the fact that there are specific forms and patterns and approaches to how you represent the saints or whatever in an icon. Those serve the same purpose, that adherence to the general principles also hold us when our skills perhaps are lacking.
That's fascinating, because I think you've just taken us right into the experience of as how you, as an iconographer and as a priest, experience tradition as something which isn't words or a formula, but something that is very whole and holds you, as you say, in that particular. When you do your iconography, this is pushing it now. This is interesting. It's fascinating, because this is living stuff. This is iconography really dug into a person's life. When you're doing iconography, do you have that same sense that somehow iconography is big enough to be able to hold you and carry you when you're in that same bad week? Or it works in obviously some way differently, but is it a similar sort of interaction, or is this something you'd not put together before? I'm just reacting to what you're saying. I think it's lovely and inspiring. There's stuff here, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that returning to my art desk and my paintbrushes is grounding. So it has that same sense of grounding me in my faith, in my connection with the divine, as much or differently perhaps, but as going to my place of prayer. It is a place of stillness and a place of inner stillness when I'm painting.
So really caught up into heaven.
I'd like to think so.
Well, I think that's what you're describing. The words speak for themselves, and presumably heaven on earth is something which we encounter. I mean, Rachel, heaven on earth, painting icons, your consecrated life, which is presumably resonating in the same way with what Catherine is doing when she's celebrating the sacraments and in her ministry, that giving herself to God. I mean, you're doing that in a different way, but still very much within the church's liturgical life. How do you respond to what Catherine's been saying and this way of looking at it?
Well, what I recognise is that I am very firmly held within the tradition of religious life and consecrated vows and so on. And in terms of religious life, it's the vows that set us free. Despite their binding nature, that's what sets us free to live the life. So there's some sort of important thing there that I can't quite get at the minute. But so there's the tradition there, but it's not a tradition that says this is how it's going to be forever and a day, ... so on. It actually sets us free to make choices as far as we can at times, and so on, about how we live, what we do, and so on. So yeah, it feels like this is really important. And the other thing that I was thinking of as Catherine was talking was, if we are going to make choices like that in life, let me talk about myself. If I'm going to make choices like that in life, then I have to know something about what drives those choices. I have to know about what I really want in life, what I really desire in life. And I think that feeds into the iconography bit as well. Because if icons are trying to capture that heaven on earth, that liminal place, heaven on earth, however we want to talk about that, then that's a fairly radical thing they're trying to do, or we're trying to do with them. And therefore, it requires a fairly radical approach in life as a whole, because I don't think you can do that separate from the whole of life. I don't think it will work. So I think it requires something fairly radical of us in trying to do that. And for me, that would be, I think, that that discipline of solitude, silence, of discernment, and so on.
So your iconography for both of you just sort of naturally weaves its way in to your broader sense of following Christ. That's what I'm hearing from both of you, that this iconography doesn't just, it's not a hobby that you go to, it's not your relaxation after a hard day's work. It may be, but in essence, it's far more important than all that, far more fundamental to you and your sense of discipleship and consecration in your different forms to God, to Christ. Am I right there?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think that's... Sorry, Catherine, yes.
I was going to say, there's something for me about that commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. I have within my heart a passion for beauty and for visual expression of the divine, and to fulfill that commandment in my life means actually to be creative and to use those creative gifts that I feel I've been given to share with others and to express that love.
I remember when I first came across icons, I was 18 and I had gone to Athens. And my friend was showing me around Athens and took me to this very tiny but very ancient Byzantine Greek Orthodox church. And I've always painted since I was a little child, and my faith was very important to me. And I've even done something when I was 16, 17 and gone down with, I think, German measles. I painted a sort of life-size Graham Sutherland on my bedroom wall. And I remember when I had tonsillitis, glandular fever, whatever it was, German measles, and being horrified by having to live with this for every day, lying in bed, and painted off as soon as I got up. So, you know, faith and art was really very, very, very important for me and connected. And I was really searching for a way of somehow doing a bit more than just drawing religiously things. And going into that church, there was this incredible sense of the holy, of heaven on earth, of God being there. And as I looked around, there was the candles and the smoke, and there was a beam of light in this dark church catching the light. So it was very numinous and atmospheric. But what struck me were the icons in the iconostasis which are covered in soot, so you just got the outlines, the silhouettes glimmering through. And I just was completely blown away. Here was heaven, and you could touch it, you could see it, you could sense it, you experienced it in a way which was more than simply as an idea in my head. It was something in my whole person. And I was also thinking, when you were talking about, the story of Rublev's Trinity in the Tetragráf Gallery during the communist era, where you go in and find babushkas, doing the prostrations before the icon in the museum, that somehow, even though it belonged in the monastery, and it's back there actually for a few days at the moment as part of the celebrations of the monastery, but its power to break through heaven on earth, it was so immense that even in that era of communist oppression, that icon in a secular museum evoked this experience of worship and adoration, of liturgy, in this desolate space. I think that's what you've both been articulating and talking about, really. At the core, it's that experience that somehow God in his fullness is present in these particular types of images. And I think, Rachel, when you said, it's not about me, it's about the image, that what the image is representing and making present, I think that's also very much part of what we're talking about here. I mean, most art is about the artist. Michelangelo is important because it's a Michelangelo, Damien Hirst because it's a Damien Hirst. But the icon's important because it's of St. Michael or Christ or the Theotokos or whatever it might be. And the iconographer is like John the Baptist, fading away so that the glory of the Lord can manifest itself. And somehow what you've both been articulating is how you wrestle to articulate that experience of making present something which touches you so profoundly that it's beyond words, and therefore it's amazing you've been able to have a conversation about it for an hour, so congratulations on that. And being touched by divine beauty, which roots itself in the end, which is that experience that we have with Christ. And I think the description of your liturgical lives, and the sense of heaven on earth, you've articulated that really very sensitively and very passionately and very personally. So I really want to thank both of you very much for having opened up so much of your own personal journey, and talked about it in a way which isn't just nice airy-fairy sort of stuff, but really very deep part of your own vocational experience and lives, and that takes a great deal of courage. For those who have been watching or will be watching who are not Anglicans, I hope people will have had their eyes opened to the depth of your own walk with Christ within the church, and your own experience of being held in God's presence through your ecclesial life, different as though both of them are. There's so many times when people get together and try and talk about this sort of thing, it ends up being an argument because, we say something else and you say something different. What I was hoping, and you've done it beautifully, was to actually transcend that and to be able to talk about how God is really present and loves you and loves us and is working through you and through your iconography in a way that is inspiring by the images that you produce. So that is just by way of saying thank you very much for an hour of your time and being willing to bear all on Facebook, which is probably very foolish, really. And I hope you don't get in trouble with your bishops. I'm sure they'll both be very inspired by what you said. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.